Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining this presentation of the economic and financial report of Esade and Banco Sabadell. I'm Tony Roldan. I'm the director of Esade, and I'm honored to be the director also of this report that we publish every 6 months. It's been published by this house, by Esade, for more than 15 years. And as I say, we publish one report in winter and one in summer. What we do is to offer, in the first part of the report, a macroeconomic context with national or whatever the contribution on the situation of the Spanish economy, and an international view as well. And in the second part of the report, we normally choose a specific topic that we think is going to be relevant for economic matters. And this time we decided to, and we asked our friends here at Esade, the people at Esade Geo, the Center for Geopolitics here in Esade, to work with us to just basically discuss the big geopolitical challenges ahead. So I'm really pleased to be joined today by an amazing panel of speakers. We're many people, and we're going to be discussing for 1 hour. I promise I will be hard and impolite with those that don't comply with the timing. And I'm going to be, as I say, accompanied by Javier Solana, who's going to give the opening speech. I don't think Javier needs a presentation, and he's going to be giving an opening speech on the current geopolitical landscape. Of course, his background for that probably is unbeatable and unknown in any other Spanish or European politician almost to have such a big trajectory in international affairs. I will be also joined by chief economist of Banco Sabadell, who's Sofia Rodriguez, who's going to do with me a short conversation of 8 or 10 minutes to discuss the macroeconomic outlook. And then we will have a roundtable with Angel Saz, who's going to be the moderator. And we are happy to be joined by Mitch Raman, who's the managing director of Eurasia Group, the political American political risk firm, and also by Samantha Gross, who's director of energy and climate security at Brookings Institution. Thanks very much for joining, also Samantha, and Yuji, who's a senior fellow at Chatham House. Without further delay, because my goal is to hear you all, and that's going to be the interesting thing here and what everyone is expecting to do. I'm going to give the floor to Javier to give us an opening view on how geopolitics is going to be relevant in this 2023. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you very much to the organizers of this annual economic report between Esade, Ekpol, and the Banco Sabadell. I'm very happy to be with all the people in the panel. They all are very good friends. We know each other for some years, and we understand very well when we think together. We think very much alike in many of the issues. So I will to talk today about the situation of the world is I don't know if easier or more difficult. Yesterday was the end of the Munich Security Council, one of the most important conferences that takes along the year, and this particular year, because the pressure was very high, and including the Chinese representation was very, very high. The analysis that it was done yesterday was an analysis that this continues to be a war that apparently nobody wants to be defeated. Nobody can be defeated, but at the same time we have to find a manner to keep on moving the world on, because there are many problems still in the world. Now, I think that another important thing that came into the debate yesterday is the relations between the countries that were present there, basically, and so the others you used to call the South, the global South, that was not so much represented, but it was part of the debate with a great interest. Now, the second thing that has happened is the trip of President Biden, which is really a very important symbolic trip. To have the President of the United States 9 hours in a train to be able to be in a place where it was at war and they were not American soldiers is a very important gesture by the President Biden. And to finish the situation, this morning we had a very tough speech by President Putin, where he has said and repeated once again that never Russia will be defeated. So, from the point of view of the international relations, we are as complicated, or even a little bit more complicated than the day before yesterday. So, I think we have to begin to get together in a different context now. And I think we have to begin seriously thinking about real outcomes of this conflict. This conflict is not only a conflict between Europeans and Russia and the United States, it's a conflict which is global. It's a conflict which is making suffering a lot to the people of the global south. So this is an international conflict, and I think the time has arrived to try to see if we can find manners in which are beginning to decrease the fighting and to begin to construct something that looks like a new world in which a new peace or a new form of having the relation between the countries which today are in difficulty, we will be able to do it. I'd like to finish by saying that I congratulate Banco Santander. They continue working with us, or us working with them. And I will offer the floor to Sofia Rodriguez, a very good economist of the bank. Okay, have a good debate.
Thanks very much, Javier. Thanks very much. Yes, Sofia Rodriguez, who's the chief economist of Banco Sabadell, is joining us today. Sofia, when we were discussing 6 months ago, when we did the previous report, the situation, there were basically two views. One that was, things are going to go really bad. We're going to see a hard landing. Inflation might go out of control. Also, with this change in direction of radical change in direction of central banks, we will go into a deep recession, and energy prices with this war are going to be skyrocketing. And then there was a second view, which was a bit more moderate, which I think it was also your view. So look, we will definitely see a deceleration or a slowdown in the economy, but we might be able to control inflation, and if energy prices go a bit down, then we might see ourselves in a different situation, in a much more favorable scenario, right? And we are definitely in that second scenario. And I would like you to tell us how you see things, or why you see things are more favorable now.
Well, yes, we have some good news, no? The main economies performed better than expected in 2022. Recent estimates of economic growth for 2023 have been revised upwards, and also recent inflation figures have shown some moderation. There are, I think, several reasons behind this. The first is the abandonment of the COVID-0 policy in China and the reopening of the country. Now, this economy is expected to grow 5% a year in 2023, from 3% last year, and it's the second biggest economy in the world. So this is important, no? Secondly, we have the mild weather conditions in Europe, which have reduced the fears of energy rationing in the region. And also, they have paved the way to an energy price correction. And this morning, gas prices in Europe were at around 50 kilowatts per hour, which compares to a maximum of 388 we had in August last year, and with an average of more than 100 also last year. No? Moreover, we are seeing that disruptions in global production chains are subsiding. And another important reason for the recent economic resilience is the fiscal support offered to households and companies by the governments to cope with the energy crisis. And for example, on an European scale, this support equates to 1.2% of GDP, which is a big figure. Also, labor markets are performing very well in many main economies. And for example, unemployment rate and the unemployment creation figure surprised to the upside in January in the United States. And finally, financial markets are behaving quite well recently, especially if we compare the current prices and volatilities to the performance we had in the first 3 quarters of last year, which was horrible. All in all, we are now expecting a better combination of growth and inflation in 2023. But this means something in terms of monetary policy, because in recent weeks, there's been a sharp repricing in expectations about interest rate hikes. And now markets expect that the main central banks will reach higher terminal rates and also will take longer to cut those rates. So, for example, if we see forward curves, now interest rates could reach 3.75% in the Eurozone, 5.25% in the US, and 4.25% in the UK. So now we have to face this increased level of interest rates.
Okay, thanks, Sofia. So Javier Solana was pointing to a number of risks and vulnerabilities on the geopolitical side, but there are also obviously some purely or mainly economic vulnerabilities that we're going to be seeing. We are somewhat digesting, if you like, the shocks that we lived last year, in terms of the supply shock coming from the energy crisis, as well as the radical change in the monetary conditions and the tightening, which was very fast and can lead to, as you know better than I do, to big instability in capital markets. We saw the cryptocurrency crisis. I mean, there are obviously risks for those that are more indebted, both firms and countries and governments. So tell us, what's the bad side of things, Sofia? What are the things that are worrying?
Of course, yes, we have some good news, but also we have important challenges ahead. No, firstly, I would say Europe has not finished replacing its energy dependence of Russia. And also, while the mild weather was a supporting factor in 2022, it's obvious that this could change at any time. No? Secondly, and more structural, another key question is what will happen in the real estate sector at a global level, given that given its high sensitivity to interest rates in general. No? During the pandemic, demand and prices of housing rebounded sharply in many countries, but now, with tougher borrowing conditions, it seems logical to assume that the price momentum will run out of steam. Of course, the focus will be more in countries in which the starting point of households is weaker, but there are many countries like that, no? And we can, for example, talk about Canada, the United Kingdom, but also Scandinavian countries. There are many countries in that situation. Thirdly, I would say we must not forget that higher international interest rates are challenging for emerging countries. And also the underlying vulnerabilities in those countries are considerable. Here, for example, the war in Ukraine and the climate change have exacerbated food shortages and aggravated food insecurity in many developing countries. Also, high inflation, low economic growth, and scant fiscal space are triggering outbreaks of social unrest. And we've seen some of those in Latin American countries recently, for example. And at the same time, political fragmentation and high levels of public debt are making it impossible for governments to meet expectations and demands for citizens. And as an example of all this is the recent episode in Brazil, no? In Brazil. Furthermore, and in terms of vulnerabilities, and continuing with something a little closer to home, no? I mean, public accounts, we think could also become a focus in the Eurozone. This year, we could see the beginning of a debate about the need for fiscal consolidation in general, and there's still the matter of the reform of the European fiscal rules, which are still suspended. And this is a delicate issue because it has to take place as the ECB begins to withdraw from sovereign debt markets. So that's difficult, no? And aside from this, I would mention only two more things. It's important to be aware of the vulnerabilities that exist in capital markets. The pension crisis in the United Kingdom after the mini budget episode is showed clearly last year this concern. The structure of financial markets is fragile, not only for the highest risk segments, but also in more secure and supposedly more liquid assets. And in general, metrics of liquidity and depth have deteriorated substantially in recent years. So financial markets is another vulnerability. And of course, a final aspect which is not easily forgotten is, of course, the geopolitical environment, but this one I will leave to the following panel.
Okay, that's great. So let's finish, perhaps, Sofia, discussing about Spain. So in the report, what we say is, look, we, unlike many people were predicting just 3 or 4 months ago, Spain will not go into a recession in 2023. We'll have a big change in growth, obviously, from around 5.5% in 2022 to around 1% in 2023, depending, of course, on many factors. And also, we are somewhat going to do better than most of our neighbors in terms of inflation and in terms of economic growth. I do see some risks, which I don't know if you share, Sofia, in terms of for the Spanish economy, besides all this good news that I just said. So we are in an electoral year. We still have a few reforms that were expected to be done that haven't been done so far, and we are also we still have. I mean, in comparison to the last financial crisis, we do have a big chunk of debt, and the fiscal trajectory. I mean, there is of course this question about, look, at some point, if you increase your structural spending a lot and you don't increase so much your revenues, and then you might have problems, and or your productivity or your growth without reforms, right? So how positive are you about the Spanish economy, Sofia?
Well, I think exactly as the same as you just said, no? Well, first, the Spanish economy is not immune to all the challenges at an international level. But yes, there are several supporting factors that will allow it to be relatively safe, no? To the different risks. One is the lower direct economic dependence on Russia. Also, we have a good starting point for households and companies in terms of indebtedness. Also, we have the resilience shown by the labor market, which is very good news. And in addition, we have the continuity of those measures taken to deal with the energy crisis, such as the so-called Iberian exception, no? But this represents a buffer against potential negative developments going forward in the energy markets. No? Within activity will gain momentum. So this year maybe we start a little bit with less momentum, but we will gain momentum given the gradual easing of inflationary pressures, the greater development of deployment of the next generation funds, no? And also the progressive resolution of the distortions of global supply chains in general. No? Anyway, as you said, it's a year we have to adapt to digest the inflation and interest rate shocks we had in 2022. And growth is expected to moderate substantially, I mean, from 5% plus to 1% plus, but it's going a big slowdown. Even though it's important to take into account this growth will be higher than the rest of the euro area, as you said, and also enough to close the gap with pre-pandemic GDP levels, which is also important because, well, at least we can leave behind that episode, no? And in terms of challenges, I would say Spain needs to carry out the exit strategy of fiscal policy, as you said. It's been very expansionary in recent years, but now the ECB will no longer support sovereign debt markets, and that's important. No? It's a game changer. Also, Spain needs to carry out an adequate management for next generation EU funds, so that they not only represent a fiscal boost, but also a real lever of transformation of the economy. And likewise, it's very important the structural reforms associated with the recovery plan, because we need them for the growth in the medium and long term. And lastly, just one word to say it will be necessary to watch out in case greater than expected, we have greater than expected persistence of core inflation, and also in case of second round effects. So actually, the inflation episode is not yet closed.
Thanks so much, Sofia. I think it was really useful, and we have many people ahead waiting for us, and probably the audience also wants to hear what we have to say about geopolitics. I do have, I think, somewhere in the screen will appear at some point, Ángel Saz, who's the director of Esade Geo, and a very knowledgeable person about international affairs. And I'm sure he's going to be providing amazing insights in the next roundtable. I leave you the floor, Ángel. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you for having us participate in this economic outlook and this report. It's been a pleasure. So we have three authors that have contributed to this report, and we have the pleasure of talking to them. Very briefly, just let me tell you how we structure this report. Mujtaba Rahman, who is here with us, he is the director of Europe at the very famous Eurasia Group, and of course he will be talking about Europe and the outlook or the political outlook of Europe. Samantha Gross, a good friend of Esade Geo, she is the director for energy policy and the climate initiative at Brookings Institution, and she will be talking about energy and how the whole war and the inflation and other related elements impact on energy geopolitics. And finally, we have Yu Jie, good friend of Esade Geo as well, from Chatham House. She is the research fellow for China and Asia Pacific program, and she will be giving us the view from China. We've asked each one of the speakers to actually summarize their writing that they did for the report. And so I will start, or let's start with Mujtaba, who will talk about Europe.
Thank you, Ángel. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. I will talk very briefly about the Ukraine war. Then I will talk about the IRA. Then I will talk about reform of the fiscal framework. And then I'll say a few final things about politics in the key member states. And I'll try and do all that in kind of 5 to 10 minutes. I'll run through these ideas very, very quickly. On the Ukraine war, I think the big question, I was in Munich, and I think the big question politically for Europe is whether the coalition, the unity underpinning the coalition, is going to hold this year. And I think that applies really to three questions. One is whether there is alignment on the end game and the trajectory of the conflict in the end game. What's the strategy? What are the Europeans attempting and hoping to achieve regarding the Ukraine conflict? That most, I think, pressingly now applies to the Ukrainian counter-offensive that will be implemented in response to the ongoing Russian offensive in the coming weeks. The big debate, I think, is about whether NATO states equip Ukraine to challenge Crimea. That's really the big debate in Munich, and I think that's being driven by a belief that only if Putin believes Crimea is under existential threat will he move to the negotiating table. And there are different views about whether or not that would be a good idea. The French, I think, are quite ambivalent and ambiguous about the impact that weapons can have, and so from that flows a more ambiguous policy. The Germans, I think, believe Crimea could be a turning point in the war, but they don't want an offensive that involves German tanks. The hawkish countries, the Poles, the Estonians, the Baltics and Nordics, believe only an existential threat on Crimea would get Putin to the negotiating table. So that's one area where there's disagreement and debate. The second big area is on the European perspective. Is Ukraine going to join the EU, and over what time frame? The big debate really is whether at the December European Council, member states take the formal decision to open accession negotiations. There are some people that are very much in support of that view, especially institutionally, Charles Michel in the European Council, von der Leyen in the European Commission. Other member states, I think, are more concerned. They're worried about process. They're worried about the vacuum in the Western Balkans and what an accelerated process for Ukraine means about political stability in that part of Europe. And then the third issue around the war is really the kind of what comes after the military conflict in terms of post-war reconstruction. Where is the money going to come from? There is a debate around the appropriation of frozen Russian assets, whether these can be seized and then the capital put to use to help rebuild Ukraine, or whether these assets can be repurposed, invested, the income they generate can then be used to rebuild Ukraine. There's a big debate about whether or not one can do that legally and politically. So that's one area, I think, of discussion. The other is the official sector. Of course, governments are going to have to pay a lot of money. Where is that money going to come from? I think we're of the view a next generation EU type initiative for Ukraine is likely. I don't think Berlin will be a constraint. I don't think the Liberal Democrats and Christian Lindner, the more hawkish parts of the German coalition, will be a constraint. But there's still a debate around that, given the amounts that we're talking about, 500-600 billion. If you think pre-war Ukrainian GDP was 200 billion, and we need to spend 500 to 600 billion to rebuild the economy in light of the devastation and Russia's war of aggression, there's a big question around where that financing will come from. And I think that's the third leg of discussion within Europe that challenges and risks coalition unity. So I think trajectory of the war, the European perspective, and what to do about post-war reconstruction, the ways in which one can generate money to help rebuild Ukraine. They are three very challenging political questions for the EU that are going to impact unity, I think, throughout the year. Moving on from Russia, Ukraine, just talking very quickly about the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. So Joe Biden spending $369 billion over the next 10 years in facilitating the US's green transition. Look, I think that's also a very difficult internal topic within the EU. There was a European Council a few weeks ago. There was an agreement in that context to relax the state aid framework until 2025. However, and importantly, that agreement was contingent upon the Europeans coming up with more financing for countries that do not have the fiscal space to subsidize their industries as much as other countries with more fiscal space will be able to do that. So the French and the Germans that disproportionately spend more money subsidizing their industries, and that will benefit from this relaxation of state aid. There is some opposition in Southern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, and indeed Northern Europe to France and Germany benefiting from that relaxation. And I think that results again in a conversation around, can more common financing be agreed at the European level, and can that common financing then flow to countries that don't have the fiscal space to ensure within the single market you're not undermining the so-called level playing field. Now, there was a commitment that was made by von der Leyen to review the multi-annual financial framework. There's going to be a mid-review. The Commission is going to put forward a proposal in June or July. And the idea is this review should effectively identify more money. That money can then be used, as I say, for the Italians and others as the basis to borrow and ensure the level playing field remains intact. Our own view is that discussion on the MFF review is not going anywhere for the very simple reason no net contributor wants to add more money to the EU budget in the middle of the cycle, and no net recipient, so the cohesion member states, want to accept a reprioritization of the money they've already been allocated. And in order for more money to come, countries would have to accept some reprioritization of the money they've been granted. And so there's like a double lock there that I think prevents the review achieving anything meaningful. For that reason, we don't think the sovereignty fund discussion is going anywhere. I happened to be in Brussels all of last week before the Munich Security Conference. There wasn't a single individual I could find in any of the institutions that believe the MFF review and the sovereignty fund is actually an initiative that's going to be a vehicle to generate more meaningful money for the South, and others that are worried about the level playing field. And I think that's our view. The reason von der Leyen is behind it is I think she wants to keep the European Parliament on side in the run-up to elections next year, where she herself is hoping to win a second mandate for a second term as Commission President. And the European Parliament, as you'll all know, is always very supportive of additional EU financing and therefore a big supporter of the Sovereignty Fund. So the debate over the IRA, I think, is challenging, it's difficult, it's going to come into focus as we move into the middle of the year, and there's a question around whether or not the Sovereignty Fund actually has any potential. I think our best case of what is likely is guarantees from the EU budget being used in concert with the EIB to effectively crowd in private sector investment into the industries where the Europeans feel they may lose competitive advantage as a result of what the Americans are doing with the IRA. I'll stop there on the IRA. Very quickly, just a minute on the reform of the EU fiscal framework, which the previous speaker also spoke about. This is very difficult. It's very political. The reason it's difficult is Germany doesn't agree with what the Commission is trying to do, which is effectively take the fiscal relationship that exists and bilateralize it between the Commission and the member state concerned, as mirrored off or based upon the Recovery and Resilience Facility. An attempt effectively to move away from multilateral surveillance and to bilateralize the fiscal relationship between the Commission and key member states, and in so doing, create a longer time frame for countries to adjust and reduce their debt to GDP levels and encourage more domestic ownership from those countries as they seek to reduce those debt to GDP levels. There are many other elements of the reform for countries that include investment and implement reform. They get 7 years to adjust their debt to GDP profile as opposed to 4 years. There are many other elements and lots of other detail as well. Germany is opposed. Germany wants to remain, I think, in a framework where you are in the economic cycle dictates the level of adjustment that you have to implement on your fiscal accounts. They want something more uniform. They want something more horizontal. They want something that's consistent for all countries. They hate the idea of an opaque process between, let's say, Brussels and Rome negotiating Italy's debt to GDP profile without the ability to seriously scrutinize and be involved in that discussion. And so the problem with the negotiation on the fiscal rules is there is a philosophical difference in worldview between Berlin and Brussels that has yet to be reconciled. What does that mean? I mean, I think, in my view, you're not likely to get agreement on a new fiscal framework this year. I think this and next year are going to be bridge years where you effectively have the European Commission articulating guidance for what they think countries' fiscal trajectory should be, and countries agreeing to move forward on that basis. There will be a discussion at the March European Council. I don't think there will be any agreement, but I suspect the Commission will say that the European Council, will tell the Commission to come forward with legislative proposals. The Commission will believe that's a mandate from the Council for them to come forward with that legislation and to use that legislation as the basis for their fiscal guidance in 2023 and 2024. It will not be the old framework. The fiscal guidance for this and next year will not be based on the old rules. That would mean very front-loaded fiscal adjustment, which is, I think, a very bad idea for the high deficit, high debt member states. But it will also not be the new rules. It will be something in between. And that will be a debate that we'll see play out over the course of the next 6 months, certainly. The final thing I would say is just on leadership. We're in a very strange situation in the EU today where you have no real leader. You have a coalition government in Germany with a weak chancellor who's a poor communicator in a difficult coalition. And you're seeing that reflected on all of the major debates where Germany is perceived to be a brake on European unity and building consensus at the European level, whether it's on tanks for Ukraine, whether it's reform of the fiscal framework, whether it's response to the IRA and agreeing to a sovereignty fund, whether it was on the gas price break that was being negotiated last year. And I think that new dynamic in Germany, the tensions within the coalition, the fact the government is prioritizing at every moment coalition unity over what is trying to be done at the European level, building consensus at the European level, I think, is something that's going to remain. In France, you have Emmanuel Macron in a minority government facing street protests and opposition in parliament to pension reform. That's important. If Macron fails on pension reform, it effectively means there is no equilibrium that he can build in parliament that will enable him to govern over the next 4 years. So people should pay attention to pension reform, not because it's interesting, but because it's key to understanding whether Macron will have the capacity to implement reform and govern effectively over the next few years. And the very last thing I'll say is on Italy, which is we have a new leader, Giorgia Meloni. She comes from the populist far right. She is so far assuming a moderate and centrist track. However, there is a risk that she will become more populist over the year as Italy loses out on these key debates at the European level, in particular on the IRA and reform of the fiscal framework. I'll stop there, Angel.
Thank you. Let's move on to Samantha Gross, who will give us a view from Brookings Institution and from the other side of the Atlantic. And just let me underscore how much Samantha loves us, that it's, 5 o'clock in the morning over there? Samantha, thank you.
It's 5:40 now, so a little bit of time has passed. So good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. And thanks so much for the invitation. So I'm here to talk a little bit about what's going on in energy markets. And I feel that most of us in the energy world are really craving a normal year. We've seen the disruptions of COVID in 2020 and somewhat in 2021. After the upcoming, we've been almost a year now at the end of this week with the Russian conflict and their invasion of Ukraine. We would just all love a bit of normalcy, but I don't believe that 2023 is going to bring that. In fact, I feel like we're just getting started with the energy impacts of the conflict in Ukraine and of the recovering economy. And so I wish I had better news and smooth sailing ahead to report, but I don't feel like I do. We'll start with oil markets, and they're experiencing something just completely different, something we've never tried to do before, in that the West, mostly the EU and G7, plus a few other countries, are sanctioning a major oil producer. Before the war, Russia was the world's largest exporter of fossil fuels in total, including oil, gas, and coal. We want to reduce Russia's income because that's funding their war machine. It's an incredibly important part of their fiscal budget. But the trick here is that we'd also like to continue receiving their oil. They're such a significant oil producer and exporter that the global economy needs some of this oil. If it stopped completely, oil prices would go up drastically, and it would really damage the global economy and worsen the inflation that we're seeing right now. Hence the price cap mechanism. This has been really pushed by the US Treasury and particularly Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. It is, in a sense, a loophole in the sanctions proposed by the European Union. What it allows is Russian oil to be shipped to participating countries in the sanctions, carried by ships and insured by insurers that are participating in the sanctions, so long as it is delivered below a specified price. This started back in December, or back in the fall, actually, for Russian crude oil, and just this past week for Russian oil products. So far, so good. Russian oil revenues have actually gone down a bit since the oil caps came in place, and so that's exciting. But I really think the oil product sanctions are the ones that are likely to be more challenging. Crude oil markets are pretty well supplied right now. And so you didn't see a big price effect when the oil sanctions took place. However, product markets, particularly diesel markets, are quite tight right now, and prices are expensive globally, in the United States as well. And so I am concerned that these sanctions on oil products from Russia is likely to exacerbate already tight markets. We also saw last week that Russia has been saber rattling for a while, saying that it's going to not provide oil to those participating in the sanctions. And it did announce that it was cutting crude oil production by 500,000 barrels per day. And so we'll see how that works out. I think we're likely to see reduced Russian refinery runs because of the sanctions on oil products, which is likely to tighten already tight distillate markets, not just in Europe, but globally. But really, the natural gas side is where the rubber has met the road in Europe. And I'll just start by congratulating Europe for getting through the winter, at least so far, in remarkably good shape. Everything from conservation measures, fuel switching, a real push to get as much liquefied natural gas or LNG into Europe as possible during these past few months meant that Europe started the winter season with its reserves full. This was incredibly important. And then a bit of luck that it has been an unusually warm winter in Europe means that, as Sophia pointed out earlier, natural gas prices have declined significantly in Europe. And the lights are on, rooms are warm, industries are still running. And this has been really great to see. There was a lot of concern going into this winter about how Europe would fare. But I hate to say it, the coming winter, the winter of 2023 into 2024, is still likely to be a challenge for a number of reasons. We heard earlier that the Chinese economy is recovering after it comes out of its severe COVID lockdowns, which will increase global demand for LNG. One of the interesting things about this crisis is that it has really been the first global natural gas crisis. We've seen oil crises happen before, but in the old days, natural gas was a much more staid business. Natural gas traveled through pipelines from producers to consumers in these long-term relationships that really looked like marriages. They were, long-term exclusive business relationships. But LNG has allowed gas to flow all over the world more freely, but it has also allowed crises to spread more freely. Europe has really been hurting. We've seen extreme fiscal support from European governments to help ease the pain of very high natural gas prices. But what has happened is some gas has been coming that would otherwise have gone to Asia. Maybe not so bad right now because of China's slowed economy last year. But as it improves, competition for LNG is likely to be fierce. We've also seen the sad issue that developing economies, those less able to chase high prices, aren't getting LNG supply at all. And the challenge is that we don't see significant new LNG coming onto the market during 2023. We had a fire in an LNG facility in the United States. That's getting repaired and will be coming online soon. But no significant new projects are coming online. So we're seeing growing demand, continuing reliance on LNG in Europe, and some new terminals in Europe coming online, but no new supply. So this really sets up a situation where you could see quite high prices and fierce competition for the LNG that is out there. Ultimately, thinking about all this holistically, the energy transition is the long-term solution to this. Reliance on more renewable and local forms of energy really prevents these kind of crises from happening in the future. But I really feel like the most important lesson of this crisis has been that we have to understand that we have to feed the energy system that we have today while we work to transition it. I think we really want to focus on, in many cases, forcing the energy transition from the supply side, reducing investments in fossil fuels, etc. But fossil fuels still matter, as the past few months have really demonstrated. And this makes business decisions and policy decisions about how to deal with fossil fuels, especially natural gas, really challenging for governments right now. But we have to remember that fossil fuels still matter. We still need them. Although we want to move away from them in the future for very important and good reasons, we do have to face the world as it is. And the issue that the energy transition will take time, effort, a lot of construction, a lot of investment. And in the meantime, we need to make sure that the energy system we have continues to function to support the economy and to support human welfare. And so I think I'll leave my remarks right there, but I'll look forward to further discussion.
Thank you, Samantha. That was another great overview. So to finish our stellar panel of contributors, we have Yu Jie, who is the Director for the China and Asia program at Chatham House. So thank you very much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and really delighted to see old friends from Esade Geo today, and also listen to the two previous distinguished speakers and comments on energy market and also on Europe. Now, when I come back to China, seems to be the things become much messier. And it wasn't really as what the presidency intended to plan from the very beginning of the year. And obviously what we have is we have a quite chaotic exit from COVID after 3 years drastic restrictions on the economy, but also on the society. And now we're also entering that phase of period of really great uncertainty on the relationship between China and the United States, interfered by a very naughty balloon across the continents. So the two elements added together and somehow make China really much hoping to have a quieter 2023 very unlikely. Now, for Beijing's intention in here, and especially in terms of its diplomatic priorities, and it comes to two things into my mind. Firstly, let's go back to October last year, during the time of the 20th Party Congress. Many of Spanish audience, I would assume Western audiences, focusing on the personal appointment and personal changes within the party. But as a China watcher myself, I actually look into the policy document and really notice some fundamental shift in terms of the languages and how China is interested in developing the relationship with the rest of the world, and really divided into two categories. Firstly, Beijing has removed the term that so-called crafting the great power relationship between China and the rest of the world. And usually the term of great power within the Chinese sense, that is referring to Beijing's relationship with the United States and Europe. So Beijing's obviously firmly concluded that much strained relationship between China and the so-called collective West is really here to stay, and it will be no time to improve at any time soon. So hence, China's emphasis will be given to the so-called global south, and also presenting the narrative that China is already itself being a part of the global south as well. Well, whether that narrative has been successful or not, that seems to be a quite mixed bag in here. And judging from the responses from Munich Security Conference last week, that seems to be many of the global south countries do not really buy into the narrative that presented by the collective West, by suggesting that why the West believed the war, the Russia's invasion in Ukraine, and it's something universal. However, many of the global south countries believe that this is Europeans' war, and why should really the global south countries bear the similar cost? So that is one narrative Beijing is also very keen to present. Now, secondly, Beijing also come to the quite acute realization that irrespective how much narrative Beijing have suggested so the global south, and how much connectivities that Beijing has increased frequently in the recent years with the global south, ultimately, to have the Chinese economy have a very quick rebound, it will have to be determined by China's more reasonable relationship with the collective West. So bearing the fact that because the economic recovery plan that is much needed by Beijing right now, and that really broke down Beijing and forced Beijing to have that sense of the so-called diplomatic reset with European countries and also with the United States. And of course, as I said earlier, given the current balloon quagmire has been happening in the past few weeks, that seems to be to making diplomatic reset with the United States rather unlikely for this year. And I think it will probably be even more unlikely in the following year that you have the two very important elections coming up. One is come from Taiwan and the other one come from the American presidential election. So let's leave America aside. Now, the piece of jigsaw in here is also Europe. And China realized, yes, they can make the argument that China and European countries are still very important trading partners, and hence China's economic well-being also dependent on how much China can export towards Europe as well. However, I think this view seems to be slightly, well, not slightly, but I think this view seems to be quite problematic, given China's rather awkward position when it comes to Russia's invasion towards Ukraine. And ultimately, the precondition to improve Beijing's relationship with Europe will largely depend on how Beijing will put itself as a daylight between Moscow and itself. And so far, I have not really seen very clear signals has been offered by Beijing by suggesting putting a clear daylight between itself and Putin. And instead, what we have is one of the most senior diplomats going to visit Moscow later this week. So it doesn't really look like as if Beijing is really keen to change its position. So hence this whole ideas and the whole narrative on diplomatic reset in here, it seems to be much harder to sell to the European audiences. Now, let's look into the global south. And of course, in the recent years, given Beijing's so-called Belt and Road Initiative and also so-called Global Development Initiative, and these are the things Beijing very keen to set in the agenda, both bilaterally with the global south countries, but also at a multilateral platform, so-called UN-led platform to setting the governance agenda. I mean, it is all go down very well, as I pointed out in the article which I've published for this magazine for Esade Geo this time. It's all very well that much of China's led initiative, depends on China's money and mind, essentially the financial resources and economic weight. But largely, to make any of the Chinese-led initiative successful, it has to look into the interests and also not just the interest, but also the ideas, the governance structures of the recipient countries. And whether those recipient countries will buy into China's argument, would buy into China's ideas and initiative, and that would ultimately determine the success of China's led initiative. So it should be less about China-centered, but it should be more about how recipient countries, and especially for those who accept China's views and seeing China, so that is one thing. What I'm not quite sure whether China could improve its relationship further with the global south in here. Now, second thing which I'm not quite sure in here as well is that while we heard the previous speakers and speaking about the global economy, and also Sophia herself spoke about the worldwide property sector, that in recent years, Beijing has conducted a so-called dual circulation strategy that is helping much to increasing the Chinese consumption to generate the domestic economic growth. That is to say, China will become less like export-oriented economic player from now on. And instead, what China will be interested in, it is to using its own domestic consumption to generate whatever the percentage of GDP, and they would expect it, which is around 5.5 this year, which I consider it is quite a moderate target. Now, the difficulties in here is really back down within the property sector within China. As many of you know in here, that it really made up 25% of the Chinese GDP growth. But the interesting element in here is that after 3 years of quite drastic lockdown, and most of the household consumption would not really have a pent-up demand as what we have experienced in Europe. The reason is because the Chinese government, until this day, has not offered individual subsidies in terms of personal incomes, in terms of household income, and instead was really only encouraging consumers to spend, but without a guarantee. So in the past, most of the consumptions has been invested in the property sector. Now, given the volatility of the Chinese property sector in the recent years, and I think it's very unlikely to persuade the Chinese consumers to be able to invest in those sectors, and then hence to generating the consumption level that Chinese government needed. Now, the second interesting element in here is that for years, Beijing has made the argument and tried to hoping to have the property sector no longer being as the main brake, the main growth engine for the Chinese economy, and instead it should be science and innovation. But that would really take some time to do so. And if Beijing have such a strained relationship with the collective West, in the past, is actually the West itself formed as a source of connectivity and talent provision regarding China's science and innovation. And that seems to be, again, to making Beijing's plan in terms of achieving that sense of economic self-reliance, scientific self-reliance, very difficult to do so. So all that added together, I'm afraid that, like other speakers, I don't really have much good news to bear in this case. But let's really hope that even if Beijing would like to conduct a real diplomatic reset, and the real diplomatic reset should be conducted in the recipient's term, but not necessarily from Beijing's term only. So I ended in here and much look forward to hear your comments and questions.
Thank you. So there's a lot to talk about. We're covering a lot of ground, and there is very little time. So I'm going to ask each one of you. By the way, Mujtaba Rahman has had to escape to the airport, so he's going to Sweden probably to cover the Swedish presidency of the council. So let me go back to Samantha and you, and with two very short questions and hopefully very short answers. Samantha, so in your article you mentioned the new economy, the dependencies in the new transition, in the new energy system where we're trying to head. So are we simply changing one type of dependency, oil and gas, for another type of dependency, lithium and other material?
To some extent, yes, but mostly no. I think it's important to understand the difference between the fuels and the raw materials in the fossil fuel base versus the new energy system. If you run out of fuels, if they're embargoed, if they're not flowing, everything stops. The current energy system can't run without fuel. Whereas at least when we're looking at raw materials, lithium, silicon, et cetera, rare earth metals, we need those to build new equipment rather than to run old equipment. And the other thing is that the fossil fuel system has been built out globally for a long time, whereas we're just getting going on really working on diversifying supply of these new materials that we need in the new energy system. And so I'm optimistic that programs in the United States, in Europe, and other countries will really help to diversify the supply side. But the difference between fuels and raw materials is a really important one and makes this a little easier to deal with.
Great, thank you for that clarification and on these dependencies. Very quick question. So you've talked about Global South. There is the Belt and Road Initiative. We've seen a couple of countries in the Global South starting to suffer, Sri Lanka, Pakistan. Do you expect a backlash against the expansion of Chinese foreign action into these countries, or you think so far this has been managed?
Well, thank you for this question. I think China already realized itself that Belt and Road is not sustainable as the way how they operate, like in the past few years. So I think we have seen a drastic decline in terms of state capital being invested in this Belt and Road initiative already. And again, let's go back to the 20th Party Congress happened in October last year. It was actually for the first time Beijing has indicated very clearly from now on the Belt and Road Initiative should be led by the Chinese companies, but should not be led by the Chinese government. So that is to say, they're looking for using BRI more like a trading and export and infrastructure building platform for the Chinese companies, and mostly state-owned companies, and less so as something more geopolitical too, that expanding China's influence anyway. Now, quite interestingly, we're now having all sort of different development initiatives come out from both China and Europe. Recently, we have the so-called Global Gateway, that initiated by the European Commission, And China also put forward to the so-called Global Development Initiative recent years as well, a much smaller scale than the BRI. I think Beijing really come to the realization that for all these many years of the BRI has been invested, the return on investment, using a financial accounting term, the return on investment has been quite minimal, really against the cost of the BRI that China has been consumed. So I think we're going to see much quieter space for that. And hence, as what I've argued, that even though you have the economic mind, but however, the recipients do not really share the same mindset with China. And that is making something more difficult for Beijing.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Samantha Gross, UGS, thank you very much for your time. I'm passing over the baton to Tony, and apologies for running over a minute.
Thanks so much, Angel. It's been great. I think we managed to cover basically the the global macroeconomy, the global geopolitics, and the specifics on European political risks, China changing political and economic strategy, the geopolitics of energy, and the decoupling from Russia, and the risks ahead as well. So that was quite ambitious to do in 1 hour and 1 minute. So thanks, everyone, and congratulations to all the speakers for what you've done. And hopefully, to everyone that is listening, I'll see you at least the latest in 6 months when we present the next report. Thanks again to all the contributors to this report, and thanks everyone for listening. Bye bye, and see you very soon.
Thank you.